So anyway, I'm Kevin. I'm Kevin Carter. I'm the web guy at Casey Stengel chapter of SABR, and we welcome Jerry Manheim, who is going to take over.
All right. Well, hey, thank you, and it's good to see everybody here this evening. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. There are a lot of downsides to this pandemic, but one of the upsides has turned out to be the ability to do these things at great distances that otherwise we might not be able to do. So let me try to share a screen now. And hopefully you see a big slide with a bunch of book covers. Is that what you see?
Right.
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Well, I want to tell you about a book that I never set out to write, which is a little bit strange, but it was a strange experience getting into this. I've been, because of COVID and just going to events and things before that, I know that there are a lot of people in SABR who do book presentations on their research about teams and standings and pennant races and players and stadiums and the like, and that's a very large and interesting literature. But there's another literature in baseball that you don't see so much in SABR, though you see some of it, and that's the fiction literature. And baseball fiction is a large and diverse literature developed over many years, and they're books of varying quality and varying type and varying focus. You get some great famous writers like Philip Roth or Bernard Malamud writing. You get some baseball, I guess you'd call them baseball fantasists, like W.P. Kinsella, who wrote a tremendous number of things. You get books like Michael Shara's For Love of the Game that got made into a movie, and Bang the Drum Slowly was a movie. So there's a lot of stuff here, but most, if not all, of these books have in common, again, a focus on players and standings and teams and sometimes real and sometimes imagined, but things that happen mostly on the field. I've written a book that I think goes on the line between these two sets of literature. It straddles the line between things that really happened and things that I only imagined happened. And that's the book that I'd like to tell you about this evening. Let's see if we can, there we go. Okay, did you just change slides?
Yes.
Okay, good, then this is working. I stumbled into this book watching TV late at night. I was watching a rerun of Antiques Roadshow, and they were showing some old military papers that some fellow had bought in a garage sale in a big box, and they pulled out a couple of baseball related papers from the World War I period. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, and didn't think much more about it, but I kept thinking about it, and I realized that what I had seen was really at variance with the delivered history of baseball from that time period, and particularly as it pertained to a couple of key players, Christy, Matheson, and Ty Cobb. And I thought about that to the point where I just felt like I had to write a book about it. And I didn't have enough facts to write a history book, and I wasn't inclined to do that anyway, because I spent a career doing academic research, and it was what I retired from, and I'd always wanted to write fiction. But I ended up with a book that's somewhere on the line between fact and fiction, and when you read it, you have to decide exactly where that line is. So that's one is not working tonight. That's the book that I want to tell you about. It's called This Never Happened: The Mystery Behind the Death of Christy Matheson. It's going to be out in about a month from Summer Game Books. And it is a book that walks the line between fact and fiction. But again, as I say, you have to decide where that line is. I know where I think it is, and I'll try to convince you that that's where it is. But then that simply creates a challenge for contemporary historians of the game. The central characters, as far as players are concerned, are Christy, Matheson, Ty Cobb. I don't have to tell people on this call very much about them. You all are very familiar with them. It's worth noting that one was a famous good guy of the game and one was a famous bad guy of the game, and yet at the same time they were both friends. Cobb didn't have a lot of friends in the game from what we can tell at this point, but Matheson was certainly one of them. And the other thing about them is they lived at a time, particularly toward the middle and ends of their careers, that was very challenging for baseball because of the historical events that were going on in the background. And those events had to do with the outbreak of the First World War. Now, the war started in Europe in 1914, and the US really didn't want to get involved in it. Woodrow Wilson ran for president with a pledge that he would keep us out of that war. But the British really wanted us in because they really needed the help. And they kept pressuring the US, but we resisted. And then one of those things that changes history happened. The German foreign minister decided to send a telegram to his ambassador in Mexico, which is the telegram down there in the lower left in code. And the thing that he didn't realize was that all of the transoceanic telegraph lines of that era ran through London. That's where they made it. From England, they went out into the Atlantic. And the English had tapped the line. So the English intercepted that telegram and they translated it. It became known as the Zimmermann telegram. You can see it's just above there, and Zimmermann's name, he was the foreign minister. And basically it was an offer to Mexico that if they would help fight the United States, that at the end of the war, Germany would make sure that they got back a whole lot of land out in the West that the US had taken from Mexico and from Spain long before that. And that telegram was leaked from London to Washington. And as soon as it became public, Wilson had no choice but to enter the war. So that happened, the US declared war, but the country wasn't prepared for that. And it wasn't accustomed to having a military that could fight on that scale. So they had a tremendous recruitment problem. And you can see one of the early recruitment posters down there at the bottom. The first thing, or one of the very first things that Woodrow Wilson did when he declared war in the very first week after the declaration was he hired this man, George Creel, and created something called the Committee on Public Information. Creel was an old newspaper man, former politician, and his job was to become the United States' first official propagandist. First, he was supposed to defend us against propaganda that was coming in from the enemy side, and propaganda was becoming somewhat more sophisticated at that time, but also he had the right to control, which is to say censor, news coverage in the US. He distributed the messages, the pro-war, pro-government messages in the US. It's a very powerful position. He was a very hard-nosed man, and he was very good and dedicated at what he did. And he used all the resources, as you can see here, all the resources that were available to him. Now, the ex officio members of the Committee on Public Information, and there's a picture down the bottom there, included senior people from the Army and the Navy, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and so forth. So this was a high-level operation. Creel is interesting in a couple of ways. One is that he was very, very hard-nosed. There's a book that Skip Desjardins did, and I'm going to hold it up here, September 1918, that was a study of the impact of the war and the plague on the World Series that year. But most of that book is actually devoted to the pandemic, the flu pandemic in 1918, and makes the point that the Army had training camps close to big cities like Boston, which was the one that Desjardins focused on. And there were influenza outbreaks in the camps, but they were so afraid that they would harm popular support for the war that they refused to close the gates to the camp, and they allowed for free flow of people and commerce and the like between the military camps and the nearby cities. And the obvious impact of that was that the pandemic spread through those cities as a result. And Creel was one of the people behind that decision. Creel also knew baseball, and he understood the propaganda value of baseball. In 1915, long before this, he had been the New York State chairman of a suffrage association. And in order to publicize the positions of that group, he and his group purchased 8,000 seats for a Cubs-Giants game at the Polo Grounds, plus 125 box seats, and they flooded the stadium with banners and things promoting the cause of suffrage. So he understood the power of baseball as a social and cultural phenomenon, and he was determined to fulfill his obligation as the chief propagandist. Well, I keep doing that. Baseball wanted to cooperate. President Wilson in 1917 was making the point that he wanted to keep baseball on the field because it was good for national morale. And baseball wanted to show that it was patriotic. So there are a lot of pictures. I've seen some of the Yankees as well. In fact, Jim Leake, in his book Dugouts to the Trenches, which is a study of this period, has pictures of the Yankees doing close order drill with baseball bats, which was kind of the model. These are the Cleveland Indians about 4 years after they were renamed from the Naps. And they're doing close order drill with actual rifles or something that certainly looks like rifles. But this was kind of what baseball was doing, was demonstrating its patriotism during this period. But it turned out not to be enough to keep the wolf from the door of the game. As 1918 wore on, the pressure built. There's a letter on the left here from Franklin Roosevelt when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy to the Commandant of the First Naval District of Boston, Massachusetts, and he's passing along a letter from Harry Frazee, who was the president of the Red Sox, who purchased them recently. And it says, you will note that 12 of his players have joined either the Army or the Navy. And I think there's no question he's in real difficulty about keeping a team on the field during the game. And he tells me that 2 of his players are actually just working as clerks in your office. And I'm wondering if you couldn't release them so he can put them on the field and make a team. So there was a lot of back and forth here where people were going into the service, baseball was trying to continue, so the politicians are trying to help them out. But in the middle of the year, the fellow in the center there is Newton Baker. He was the Secretary of War and a member of the Committee on Public Information. He decided that there was going to be a draft, but that baseball players would be exempted from that draft. And so the draft started, and so did the resentment. Why should baseball players be exempt when everybody else has to go? So in July, he changed his mind and decided that baseball players would no longer be exempt. And there's a telegram from him from Frazee to Gary Herman, who was the chairman of the National Commission, who says, you know, Baker's made this order. If the president backs him up on it, then I think we need to cut the season short. So you can see the kind of dynamic that's going on there. And I'll read you this cartoon because I know some of you are on small screens and there's some small print here. But this is a cartoon from when that happened. It says, baseball players must fight or work in war necessities industries if within the draft age. And the player is saying, if I fight, a soldier's pay will not pay my wife and children's keeping with the high cost of living, and it will take a long time to learn a lucrative craft. So it's a gloomy outlook for baseball, the national game. This is where things were. And the pressure finally reached the point where baseball had to do something, and the players had to either go into these defense industries or go into the military. Now, a lot of them quite a number of them went into defense industries where they played, and sometimes their only responsibility was to play on teams in industrial leagues. This looks like a team photo of Bethlehem Steel, but actually Bethlehem Steel operated an entire 6-team league from 6 of its locations. And there's a piece of research from SABR by Brian McKenna about Bethlehem Steel and their league, in which he counted up 71 active or future major league players who were playing on one or another of these 6 teams. And he had names like Eddie Plank and Babe Ruth and Joe McCarthy and Joe Jackson. They were all in the Bethlehem Steel League. Now, Joe Jackson was one of the last ones to make the move from in that case, the White Sox to Bethlehem Steel. And when he did, Ban Johnson expressed a degree of upset. He said, "The American League does not desire to impugn the motives of players who have gone into this industrial work." And then he proceeded to impugn them. Some of them are patriotic, but if there are any of them who are Class 1A, I hope Provost General Crowder yanks them from the shipyards and steelworks by the coat collar and places them in cantonment to prepare for future events on the Western Front. The American League does not approve of players trying to evade military service. Now, you can take that for face value, or you can take it as pique about Joe Jackson, but it's also possible that it was something else as well, or something else altogether. Remember that it was only 4 or 5 years before this that the Federal League had made a run at becoming a major league. 1914 and 15, this is when Kennesaw Mountain Landis sat on the case, and the Federal League just sort of went bankrupt, went away. But it was an effort to buy players away. And Johnson was apparently concerned at some level that the industrial leagues threatened to emerge as principal competitors to the major leagues after the war, that if they had all these prominent players and they could pay them or were willing to pay them better, that might be some competition as well. So it's possible that was going on. In any event, there were a great number of players who went into the industrial leagues, but that didn't solve the problem of the military. The military still had a recruitment problem. And one of the places they had the biggest recruitment problem was in the new Chemical Warfare Service, which was also called the Gas and Flame Division. And the fellow here is William Seibert, who was the first general in command of the Chemical Warfare Service. And there was a meeting in 1918 in the summer in Washington, where they determined that they really had to get a lot more people into this service, and they needed to do it by finding ways of recruiting young men and showing them that they ought to be willing to take on this dangerous duty. So they called together all of the leading journalists in Washington at that time, and they held what today we would call a press conference. And they announced this plan, and the full quote is longer than the part that's here, but basically they said that they wanted baseball players and other athletes, and it didn't matter how old they were, just to come in because they were athletic kinds of people, and they could do this work, and they would basically show other men around the country that it was safe and appropriate to do this dangerous work, and that they ought to be willing to serve in the Chemical Warfare Service. So it was a major recruitment effort. Now, General Seibert got in touch with Perry Houghton. Perry Houghton had retired in 1916 as the head coach of the Harvard football team, which I guess back then meant something. And he had, since that time, and more recently, purchased about a 10% interest in the Boston Braves. So he was now a baseball guy. And he made Perry Houghton a volunteer major in the Chemical Warfare Service, and got Houghton to contact Branch Rickey, who had just been fired by the St. Louis Browns, and made Branch Rickey a major in the Chemical Warfare Service. And then Rickey, in turn, recruited Ty Cobb and Christy Matheson to be captains in the Chemical Warfare Service. And this kind of catches up to the history that a lot of us are probably familiar with. The story is that just like Frazie's telegram suggested, the season ended a bit early, and Matheson and Cobb went into the Chemical Warfare Service as captains, and in the fall they were shipped over to France. And when they got to France, they were put through some training, and there was a training accident, and they were exposed to poison gas. And as Cobb puts it in his autobiography, which is not the only account of that incident, when I staggered out and gulped in fresh air, I didn't know how badly my lungs had been damaged, but Matheson said to me, "Ty, I got a good dose of the stuff. I feel terrible." And it's from this incident that the subsequent history spins out, where Christy Matheson comes back, his lungs are damaged. He's a national hero, which he was before that in any event, famous athlete and all, but now he's a war hero, wounded in war, his lungs damaged. He ended up dying of tuberculosis in 1925. And the story took hold. Here is an example of the Associated Press obituary from his death, and I'll just read you this one paragraph. "A hero of the World War as well as of the Diamond, on which he was the first big college star, he died late last night of tuberculosis and pneumonia, the result of being gassed while a captain in the Chemical Warfare Service in France." So this is a story that is fixed in history, and probably most or everybody on this call is familiar with it, except more recently, there are some questions that have been raised about it. Howard Rosenberg, a couple of years ago, in an article in Inside Sources, pulled together some of them. One is that there's an affidavit that he or someone found up at the Hall of Fame claiming that Matheson's exposure to poison gas, and this is according to a divisional surgeon, actually happened somewhere else in France and only after the war had ended. Then Amos Fries, now Seibert was the first commander of the Chemical Warfare Service, and Fries was his successor as a second commander. He said it never happened, that Matheson was never exposed to anything more than some harmless training gas, and not really very much of that. And Branch Rickey, who played a central role in this story, said that he was with Matheson throughout the training in France, and he said there never was an accident. In addition, I don't think it's in Rosenberg, but Christy Matheson had a brother, Henry, who in 1914 contracted tuberculosis and died of TB in 1917. So it's entirely possible that Matheson's exposure to TB was unrelated to any sort of poison gas incident. And the other confounding factor here, at least one other, is that the vast majority of the official military records from World War I, the personnel records, were stored in a repository of the National Archives out in St. Louis. And in 1973, there was a massive fire in that archive. It took days to put it out, and almost all of those records were lost. So there's a very limited set of things that you can go to check this out. But there are some records, as it turns out. Let's use some imagination. What if there was a camp in Georgia, a training camp, where this gas and flame division trained, where they learned to work with the chemical weapons, with the poison gas, gas masks, and the like? And what if the Army and baseball created a show unit, and that show unit actually had 7 future Hall of Famers in it? Now, this is 1918. Nobody's even thought of a Hall of Fame. But they were recruiting prominent players, perhaps. That was certainly the intent of Creel and Seibert. So let's say that they created a show unit that has 7 future Hall of Famers in it. And let's say that the unit was led by an officer, lieutenant, actually second lieutenant, Christy Matheson, and he reported to Major Branch Rickey. And let's say that members of this unit included Corporal Frank Baker, Corporal Max Carey, Private Frank Chance, Corporal Ty Cobb, Private Davy Jones, Ordnance Sergeant Honus Wagner, and Private Ed Walsh, all but one of whom, Jones, is now in the Hall of Fame. And let's say that there was actually documentation that showed that all of these players were down in Georgia at this camp training on poison gas. And at the same time, there are official baseball records showing that some of them, the ones who were still active, were playing or managing in major league games. Two different realities. There's a law of physics that says that the same people can't be in two places at the same time, but there might be documents that suggest that they were. And we don't have to imagine, this was what in today's parlance we would call a propaganda dream team. I mean, all these guys in one unit working together, that's a propaganda dream team. But the Hall of Fame has no record of it. It doesn't appear in any histories of the game that I've come across. It doesn't appear in the biographies of any of these players, and it doesn't appear in the contemporaneous press of the day. What could account for that? Well, as it turns out, there was such a place. It was called Camp Hancock. It was just outside of Augusta, Georgia. And as you can see from the photo at the top of the screen here, it wasn't a beauty spot. It was dirt and mud and tents and some old buildings, one of which was a great big hospital, as it turns out. Now down at the bottom of the screen, I've got three maps. The map on the left is the city of Augusta, Georgia, approximately 1909. So this is from approximately the same period. And the map on the lower right is the map of the structures of Camp Hancock. And I will read, I'm sure you can't read the bottom unless you have a really big screen. So let me read some of this to you. Camp Hancock, Augusta, Georgia. Construction started July 19, 1917. And talks about the contractors. Number of buildings erected, 1,319. Camp capacity, 45,099 men. Total area of the camp, 13,811 acres. And of the camp proper, 1,777 acres. So the 1777 is this part of the camp. The city of Augusta, bottom left, is actually center top of the middle map at the bottom here. The camp structures are this little area here, and all the rest of this was part of Camp Hancock. It was where they tested the ordnance and trained people and so forth. So there was such a camp. And there was such a unit, as it turns out. These are the two papers that got me started. Now, I'll tell you that certainly this one is difficult to read. I have yet to see the originals of these papers. And I was working from a fuzzy 20-year-old TV image and had to do some enhancement and then work with an illustrator to bring out the elements. So there could be some errors here, but they are not substantive errors. And we also introduced a couple of errors just so we could always tell the fictitious illustrations from the actual documents. But I will tell you that the essence and the substance of both of these documents is precisely what was presented. This is the payroll from Ordnance Company, Depot Company number 44, Camp Hancock, Georgia, June 1 to June 30. Now, one of the things we changed was the closing date. The actual date on the original paper is June 20. So June 1 to June 20. And I've put the names of some of the players over here to the left so you could read them more easily. The top one is John Wagner. Now, it could be somebody named John Wagner, but I would suggest to you in the context of the other names on the list and the time period involved, that people whose names were Johann or Honus or Hans, Germanic names, as we entered into World War I, were anglicizing their names. It's also possible that the company clerk didn't know how to spell Johann and wrote John, but I would argue this is Honus Wagner. Ty Cobb, Max Carey, Frank Chance, Davy Jones, Ed Walsh, Frank Baker. And it gives you their Army serial numbers and their rates of pay and the date that they joined up and so forth. So it is an official, apparently official payroll, was authenticated by this fellow. And here is the second one, which is a bit easier to read. It was in ink. And if you stop to look at it, it's actually kind of interesting. And let me get to a page because there's several things to talk about on these documents. The first thing to note, and there are anomalies. And when I was looking at the anomalies, this is what got me started really thinking about how this all might have happened. If you look, for example, you'll see that on the top half, the dates are written by a different hand than on the bottom half. They're presented differently. June 1, June 2, June 6th, June 7th. You'll see that June 3rd is out of date and that there was some sort of notation over here, but on the original, it was torn off just like it is here. And you'll see that there's a Private Armstrong who transfers in, and remember, they didn't have jet airplanes in 1918, transfers in from Camp Fremont, California on June 4th. And 2 days later on the 6th, he transfers out to Camp Merritt, Pennsylvania. So he spent a lot of his time on the trains, if this is to be believed. Davy Jones gets promoted to corporal. If you look at June 5th, Christy Matheson is hospitalized. Private Chance is hospitalized. Private Stone is quarantined. And they eventually find their way back. Matheson is in the hospital until June 9th when he returns to duty. Jones goes on furlough and comes back to duty. So there's a lot of things going on here. Armstrong, according to the daybook here, leaves the unit on the 6th, but according to the payroll, transfers out on the 5th. There's just a lot of stuff going on here. Too many hands, different writing, too many people moving in and out, a lot of inconsistencies. The date moving around, notes being torn off. It just sort of made me a little suspicious. Also note that the last date in the daybook is June 10th, nothing after that. But the unit was originally supposed to be in camp from June 1st to June 20th. So they stopped 10 days short. This is Army paperwork that shows that these men were in Georgia the period from June 1 to June 10. Here's where we start to use our imagination again. What if there was an incident at this training camp in chemical weapons? The incident involved Christy Matheson, Ty Cobb, and others in the unit, and illustrated the dangers of working with chemical weapons. Now you have to think about that in context. The Army and baseball, but mainly the Army, have gotten together and they have put these players together for purposes of propaganda, and they want to demonstrate that it's safe working with this poison gas because they need to recruit people into the ordnance service of the Army, and something bad happens. Now, this is a high-profile unit, it's a propaganda unit, it's a potential disaster. If any of you are in crisis management or anything, public relations, anything related to that, you know that when something like this happens, there are two things that you are inclined to do right away. One is pretend it didn't happen, find a way to make it go away. And the other part of that is to point over somewhere else at a bright, shiny object so people are distracted and they aren't looking for it. So you cover it up and you come up with a cover story. And that's what I have posited, that there's a meeting at Camp Hancock and the Army brass are there, the baseball brass are there, Committee on Public Information, George Creel is there, and they move decisively because they have to move decisively to cover up this incident, and they develop a cover story. And that cover story sends Cobb and Matheson to France, where there's a training accident that supposedly occurs. And remember, there were doubts raised about whether that actually happened in France. But here it's part of the cover story. So Matheson and Cobb go off to France, and they agree to do that for the same reason that they agreed to join this unit in the first place, because they were patriotic. This wasn't the first thing that you would choose to do, even if you wanted to go in the Army, but Cobb and Matheson, they agreed to do that. Even the delivered history tells us that. As for everybody else in the unit, they all either get sent to the front or they get sent to other training camps. Remember how, what was it, Armstrong moved in and out so quickly? or they get sent home. But before that happens, this is a national security thing. It's an important recruiting thing. So everybody is warned, you don't talk about this on pain of death. This is national security and we'll come get you. So what if at this meeting, George Creel is there and he closes the meeting with these words, consistent with this entire story. Gentlemen, remember, for the good of the nation, for the good of the Army, and of course, for the good of baseball, this never happened, which is where the title of the book comes from. Well, we saw the documents putting those players at Camp Hancock the first week of June. This is from Baseball Register, and it's just one example of the official baseball records, which show Ty Cobb playing first base, going 2 for 4 with an RBI and a triple on June 7th in a game against the Senators, the exact same time that the Army has him in Georgia. And then you can look at the local press. Now, there are 2 newspapers, at least were then in Augusta. One was the Augusta Chronicle, which is still published today. And their archive is not online, but I was in touch with an editor there who was very helpful in a lot of ways. And one of the things he did is he went into the private archive of the Chronicle back to the period of time that we're interested in to see if there was a reference to those players being in the area that week. And there was no reference to them whatsoever, despite the fact that Augusta was a baseball town. There was spring training held there some years. Cobb was a local, and I think had even gotten his start in the minor leagues there, but no reference at all in the Augusta Chronicle. The Augusta Herald is much more interesting in a way. These are clips from 3 days. The one in the center, and I'm losing, there's my arrow. One in the center, Soldiers to Meet Sailors Saturday, is from Friday, from the Friday paper. And it says that there was a baseball game scheduled between a team from Camp Hancock and a team from the Charleston Navy Yard. Bids fair to be the game of the season, with both sides present a formidable lineup. ... The Camp Hancock 9 will be made up of such players as Howard, Butler, and Dwyer, former professional stars who've already cavorted on the Augusta ball lot. We don't write like this anymore. With the addition of such men as Gaffney, former International League slugger. In other words, there's no reference there to any of these players that we know were in camp. The clip on the right is from Saturday, the day of the game, and it prints the lineups of the 2 teams. And you can see the Camp Hancock lineup includes Thomas, Larson, Howard, Putnam, Dwyer, Butler, Donahue, Gaffney, and Auer. And again, what you don't see there is Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner and Home Run Baker. The rest of them, they're not there. So as far as those 2 baseball games were concerned, they were never in camp. But then you get over, and it gets kind of interesting if you're willing to speculate a little bit. The Augusta Herald from Sunday. Now, if you were bringing in a propaganda team with all these prominent players, and the idea was to get a lot of attention to the fact that they were training on dangerous weapons, certainly one of the things that you would do if you were the base PR people or the Committee on Public Information for that matter, is you would get in touch with the local paper and you say, look, we're going to have this really famous bunch of people in town training on these dangerous weapons this week, and we'd really like to get some publicity for that. So we're going to have a ball game. And what about, have you thought about doing a special Camp Hancock edition of the newspaper? Now you have to remember this camp has been open for a year. But here, this is the Sunday morning, June 9 edition of the Augusta Herald, and it's the special Camp Hancock edition. It says up there in the upper right, and left-hand headline, 3 crack regiments make up the ordnance camp at Hancock. The officers here, the base commander, this fellow is the chief PR officer of the base. So they've got set up to cover a game, but the game ends up not happening. They're set up to feature the camp, and if you're a newspaper editor, you know that what you're going to do is you're going to set aside a lot of space to write up the fact that Honus, Wagner, and Home Run Baker and Ed Walsh and all these guys are in town, and Christy Mathewson is in town running this unit. You're going to write it up big time. So you set aside 3 columns inside the newspaper, and then you get the call that says, well, you can't run that. And George Creel could make that stick. He could keep them from publishing anything. He was empowered to do that. You're not going to run that story. They're not going to be in the ball game, but go ahead and say there's a ball game and get those players up. We'll get the Charleston guys down here to play them. And you're the newspaper editor. You have this giant news hole. What do? Well, what you see here is 3 columns that list by name the 250 privates who were military police officers at Camp Hancock at that time. Now, I will just leave you with the question, is the listing of individual names of 250 privates who are military police worth 3 columns inside your feature special edition newspaper? And when you run out of space, you start listing the churches. You know, I have a view of what's likely to have happened there. You might take a different view. It's a reasonable question. So this gets me to my book. All of this is actually part of the book, of course, but the book is set in 3 time periods. The first time period is World War I, where something happens and the cover-up is initiated. And these 3 time periods weave through to the book so that they're all present all the way through the book. The cover-up is effective. Everybody's sent home or off to war. Some don't come back from that unit probably. The second time period is 1936. This is when it's announced that there's going to be a Hall of Fame, and the very first group of selections are made, including Matheson, Cobb, and Wagner, along with Babe Ruth and Johnson. And this, in 1936 in the book, the cover-up is discovered, but then it's lost to history again. And then there's treatment of the present day when things sort of bubble to the top and some surprising activities take place. There are 3 sets of characters in the book. From the World War I period, they are real people. The players, Christy Matheson, Ty Cobb, and Branch Rickey, play central roles. The other players are playing roles in the book as well, in addition to other members of that unit. H.R. Barnum was the real clerk of the Real Ordnance Depot Company number 44 at Camp Hancock, and he plays a role in the book. And George Creel plays a role. So those are the principal characters dating to the World War I period. The rest of the periods are fictional. Principal characters in 1936, J.T. Willett, I've portrayed as America's premier baseball writer. He's really a sort of combination of Grantland Rice and Henry Chadwick and a little bit of Damian Runyon, but he's presented as the baseball writer of the era. And Jocko Drum, who's an itinerant ne'er-do-well, who suddenly finds himself a gentleman farmer. And the principal characters in the present day are Jocko's grandson, Jason Drum, and a friend of his, Adam Wallace, who happens to be a professional writer and researcher. And they weave their way through these stories as everything gets revealed. I'm going to read you 2 fairly brief passages just to give you a flavor of what's in the book since it's not out quite yet. The first passage is J.T. Willett was a kid who grew up working behind the bar and in the back room at the card tables in his parents' tavern in Trenton, New Jersey, but it's not what he wants to do. So he goes off to New York, and he ends up being hired by William Randolph Hearst for the New York Journal as a baseball writer, the first official baseball writer of the journal. Arts and crafts. Baseball at the professional level was a craft. Its practitioners were adept at using their hands to shape the game, and the game was played within the lines: balls, strikes, outs, hits, runs, wins, losses, standings. Baseball was addition run wild. The numbers added up, and the team with the best numbers at the end of the game was the winner. At the end of the season, the champion. But interesting as that might be to those who closely followed the sport, and integral as it might be to reporting on it, JT came quickly to realize that this basic arithmetic would not extend to newspaper circulation. Few new readers would subscribe to the journal just to read statistics. He knew he needed more, and he found it almost without trying. The players of this game were men of interest in themselves, and some of them in quite outrageous ways that matched perfectly with the style of the paper. JT befriended them, told their stories, made them famous. The communities where they lived were the collective essence of the city itself, especially its ethnic enclaves, and they were filled with prospective subscribers. JT told their stories as well, through the players who became their heroes and their symbols of acceptance and achievement. And then there was the game. Not exactly cerebral to the casual observer, but as JT came to understand the basics, he came as well to understand that there were stories behind the basics: who stories, how stories, and especially why stories. Origin stories, stories of friendships and personality conflicts, funny and sad stories based on players' experience, and above all, stories of strategy and of the mental game within the game, all of which he set out to tell, even where, in the great tradition of the journal, he had to make them up. If baseball was a craft, JT Willett became the artist who painted its portrait. And then the second passage is where JT is about to set off. He's about to discover that something happened down at Camp Hancock, and he gets started on this quest when he's interviewing Jane Matheson for a series he wants to write about the players who've been inducted in the first group for the Hall of Fame. JT read Cobb's letter, then he read it again. Jane, what is this about? What did that old miscreant do? You know all about Chris in the war, right? And how he got accidentally gassed over there in France. And after he recovered, he came back a hero. Well, he was a hero, but not the same way that everybody thinks. There was a lot more to it. It's all that old Mr. Ricky's fault when you get right down to it. Branch Rickey? Of course, Branch Rickey. Back after the war started, and you remember how the government was putting all that pressure on baseball, calling players unpatriotic and all that. I remember. Well, one day Chris gets this letter from Mr. Rickey. Personally, I think that hypocrite Wilson put him up to it, but that's just me talking. Anyway, Chris gets this letter and says Branch is going to be an officer, and he wants Chris to come and serve in his unit. I've got that darn letter here somewhere, or here. And she handed JT a second document. Now, he didn't say right away what that unit was. And you know Chris, he always wanted to do the right thing, loved the country, and he loved the game. So Chris writes back and he says, yeah, of course I'll join up. Now, I'll tell you, JT, I begged that man not to do it. I pleaded with him, but I never had a chance. So then, just before he was ready to leave, Mr. Rickey tells him what they'll be doing. Defusing bombs and canisters of mustard gas, teaching soldiers to use gas masks as if they were experts themselves. Can you believe it? Well, I hit the roof, but Chris, he just smiled and said, Janie, somebody's got to do that work. Guess it's me. And off he went. So when you put all of these pieces together, you got documents that say that they were training in Georgia in June of 1918, but that's the only indication at this point that that was the case. It's not in the newspapers. It's not in the histories. It's not in the biographies. It's as if this unit simply didn't exist. Why is that? And how can it be that this special unit that was obviously designed and recruited expressly with propaganda and recruiting in mind, how has it stayed secret all of these years? Now, my book, This Never Happened, is an imagined answer to that question. It's a pure fiction. It's a what might have been. But if this is a fiction, you still have to wonder, what's the fact? If this never happened, what did? Now, JT Willett, the sports writer, knew the answer to that question, but of course he was fictional and he never got to tell the answer anyway. But if those documents are as authentic as they seem to be, and there's a URL in the book that'll take you to the video clips that show them. But if they are as real as they appear to be, then there is a conundrum. There is a historical anomaly. There are players in two places at the very same time. And contemporary historians of the game may want to figure out exactly how that came to pass. So this is the book. This never happened. It's available now for pre-order, and there is pre-publication pricing from Summer Game Books, or if you prefer Amazon. If you'd rather wait, it's due out the end of April. And if you'd like me to just send you an email when it comes out, you can send me one, jerry@themanheims.net, including your name and your email address and the subject line TNH, and I will be happy to do that. And that is what I have.
That was very entertaining. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. I was curious because, you know, obviously there's a big fictional characterization of Christy Mathewson. That was the one I think I was using a celebrant, and I wondered if whether or not
I'm having difficulty understanding.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So you know, the big famous fictional characterization is Christy Mathewson, and I think of as the celebrant. And I wondered how that or other fictional characterizations either influenced your characterization of him, or, you know, like for better or for worse, whether you use that, whether you didn't, whether you tried to not think about it, or kind of how you, if that meant anything.
Well, the celebrant is a really, of all the baseball literature, it may be among the one or two or three pieces that are closest to actual literature as opposed to baseball books. That's a great story. But it focuses in on Matheson per se, and what I've done here, Matheson plays a central role here, Cobb plays a central role here, but the focus isn't exactly on them. The focus is on this series of events and how baseball as an institution ended up dealing with the challenge of the war, and then the challenge of this thing that happened, which I don't want to say more about. So what I tried to do in characterizing Matheson was to stay true to the basic biographical information that we have that's fairly common and consistent, but at the same time take into account the historical information that we didn't have, and try to imagine the story that wove those two things together. And I think I would argue that at the end of the book, you might find that it's a pretty logical, even if fictional, it's a pretty logical case that's made, that the events that I made up and the events that are documented both by baseball and by the military can be fit together into a relatively seamless narrative. So yeah, I know that book, I love that book, but I wasn't trying to position the character vis-a-vis that. In a sense, the papers, those two pieces of paper, are the central characters of this book in a sense.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Hey, Jerry, I was curious to hear a little bit more about your efforts to get to the original documents from that Antique Roadshow.
Sure. I won't go through all of it, but you know, what I wanted to do was to get to those documents and photograph them. And it wasn't easy, and in the end, it ended up being honestly impossible. I contacted the appraiser who did the appraisal in 2003 and reappraised them in 2018. And he remembered the papers, but didn't know whose they were. I tried WGBH, which made the program. They never responded. I contacted the public television people in Augusta and also in Savannah. The program was broadcast out of Savannah, but the events were in Augusta. So I tried both stations there. tried the newspapers in Augusta, tried the newspapers in Savannah, and got in touch with the editor who was there at the time and the two reporters who covered the program when it was broadcast, but they didn't remember anything about it. I talked to people at military museums because the papers that were found, the context was a military collector, not a baseball collector, which is probably how all of this remained lost for so long. So I talked to curators of military collections as far away as Oklahoma, and put out a cry for help on SABR to see if SABR, anybody had heard about it. And in the end, the only thing that was left to me was to take these grainy images and enhance them, and then get John Payne. And when you read the book, which I hope everyone will do here, but when you do, you'll see that there are quite a number of documents. Those two are real. We also have a number of documents that he created that are fictitious to drive the story along. But he did a wonderful job of making everything look real. And in the case of these two documents, they look exactly like the originals, down to the tone of the paper and pencil and ink and the like. The only thing we did, because we didn't want to actually commit forgery, was we introduced some changes. However, these documents are more than 100 years old, and they were government documents at the time, so they are public domain. In the book, the best I could do was to give our best judgment about what was in the papers and in detail, and then provide readers with a URL where you can go and see the appraisal itself and hear what's said about them, and maybe find some hints that I didn't find to tracking them down.
Were they appraised for a lot of money?
They were appraised for $2,000 in 2003, and they were reappraised for $2,000 in 2018.
Jerry, is the case closed as far as you're concerned, or are you going to continue a pursuit of the facts?
Well, like I said at the beginning, I didn't set out to do a empirical research paper. I spent 40 some years doing those as a political scientist, and that's what I wanted to retire away from. I had always thought about writing fiction, but after I don't know how many tries that never got past page 3, I decided I couldn't do it. And then I got intrigued by this, and suddenly I found out how to do it. And it's become a thing. I've used the pandemic. I've got 3 more books behind this that I need to go find publishers for, and I just started another one. They all kind of interrelate, but this is the crown jewel, because it really does start things from this real history, and it really does present a real challenge about how you can be on both sides of this line where this historical anomaly appears. So the answer to your question is no. I've gone off and made up some other stories, but I hope someone gets interested in pursuing this, and I'd certainly be willing to help them any way I can. But I sort of took it as far as I felt I could, and still write what I wanted to write.
I don't know about you, but I mean, I find it as a SABR member and knowing people in SABR for many, many years, somewhat astounding that you're the first person to do this. I mean,
well, I was surprised, because that's why one of the first thing I did was I went on the general mailing that SABR puts out every day, and asked if anybody had come across this, figuring that somebody would have. And at least the people who saw that had not, and it's not in the archives of the Hall, as far as I can tell. One of the people I was in touch with down in Augusta is a local Ty Cobb specialist, and he didn't know anything about it. And he's got a room full of Ty Cobb memorabilia and books and things. And I think it's because it wasn't among baseball papers. This was an obscure training camp in an obscure corner of Georgia. If anyone's from Augusta, I apologize, but back then it was pretty obscure. It was a big camp. I mean, the camp itself, I was down there and got a tour of the camp, and that ground that you saw on the map is now taken up by a great big regional VA medical center, housing developments, a shopping center, a general aviation airport where the CEOs fly in and park their private planes the week of the Masters, a golf course, not Augusta National, but it's a big place. And I have some local historian had done an overlay map of the camp onto modern day Augusta, and I've got a copy of that he was kind enough to provide. So it was a big place, but the story was a military story, and it got stuck in a box of obscure military papers that somebody was throwing out or putting in a garage sale, and somebody else just bought the box, and after a while was poking through and found these papers, and Roadshow was in town and they took them there. And that apparently is what it took.
Okay, very good. I'm gonna jump in here. We've overshot our time limit on the SABR thing. I want to thank Jerry for coming. It was a wonderful presentation. The book sounds like a lot of fun. Looking forward to reading it. And thank you for everyone for coming.
And thanks, Kevin, for the invitation, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
Good
you,
job.
Jerry.
Everyone
Thank
have,
you, Kevin.
everyone have a great night.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks, Steve Marino.
Kevin, just want to say thank you again.
Okay, good night.